Herzlich willkommen.
Sandra Matz, you are a doctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. Can you give a brief introduction of yourself and your research interests?
Hi, I'm Sandra Matz. I'm a computational psychologist and consumer researcher. I'm at the University of Cambridge. So what I'm interested in is really how we can use a combination of big data and psychological theory to personalize our experience online and the way that we experience the digital world.
Before I go into depth, just a few introductory remarks. Can't Buy Me Love, the mega hit of the Beatles. To what extent does it confirm or deny your research on spending and happiness?
Well, I have to say that I really love the song, and I think that it very nicely captures the belief that actually money is something that can't really buy us love, can't really buy us happiness. And for a long time, the research or the scientific evidence that we had was actually confirming the assumption, because we know that GDP in countries like the UK went up over the last decades, but the happiness simply didn't, the life satisfaction didn't. And the same was true on the level of the individual. So above a certain kind of threshold that was very low, increased income or increased spending didn't really do anything for people's happiness. So for a long time, the conclusion was really that money can't really buy us happiness. However, money's actually recently come back to the table because researchers suggested that maybe if money doesn't buy us happiness, it's because we're not spending it right. And they showed actually that if money can buy us happiness if we spend it on experiences rather than material goods, or on others rather than ourselves. And now coming to my own research, what I have suggested is that basically spending it right means spending it in a way that is in line with our psychological needs and preferences. So what we've shown is that if people allocate their spending in a way that matches their personality, they're actually happier. So you can think of an extrovert spending their money on going to the pub, having a good time with their friends, experiencing something stimulating and exciting, and an introvert rather allocating their spending in a way that helps them make the most of the quiet me time that they want to have, such as reading a book.
Personality-centric spending, targeting and visualizing are main fields of your research interests. What made you decide to go into them?
Yeah, so I think what I find most interesting about this line of research is really that consumption is something that affects all of us. So whether we like it or not, it's quite a big part of our everyday lives. And as a psychologist, what is really interesting to me is how it affects us, how it affects our well-being, and what we can actually do to make the money work for us rather than constantly worrying about working towards more money. And the whole field of personalization and customer-centric marketing, which is very closely related to that, is so attractive to me because it's so fast-paced and it's so cutting edge. So pretty much every day there's new technology coming to the market that's aimed at helping us find the stuff that we're really interested in. And I think as a psychologist we really have the opportunity to contribute to that and to find ways of actually bringing back this human element to personalization and the digital world that helps us make better decisions and really find the stuff that is interesting to us.
You did some research on spending money and well-being. If you look at it, what can be applications of that research and what parties might benefit?
So I think, one of the main applications of my research is really customer-centric marketing. And what we've seen over the past few years is this continuous shift from what is called product-centric marketing. That is, companies start with a product and they try to optimize their marketing strategy around the product. And it's basically been that there's been this continuous shift towards a more customer-centric approach where businesses really start with a customer and they try to optimize their services by focusing on the individual needs and preferences. And what's really crucial in that context is that you understand these needs. You understand what is it that makes customers happy, what is it that doesn't. And in that sense, the idea of customer-centric marketing is really one of dual value creation that creates value for companies but also customers. So on the one hand, yes, it helps customers to find products and services that are of interest to them and that also help them to lead happier lives. But of course, companies are not so, like, the ultimate goal for the company is probably not to make the customer happy, but to increase their profits. And again, the idea here is that if you have a happy customer, it's one that will create the biggest value for the company in the long term, because they turn into loyal customers and they don't just purchase once, but they actually come back again and again and again.
Your research is predominantly done online and moreover in the social media. What does this mean for the application of doing research offline in the real world, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, I think that actually the fact that we're doing research online gives us the chance to capture the real world much better than what was previously possible offline. I mean, if you take psychological studies, and the majority of them has always been done with undergraduate students in the lab. And of course that's great, because in the lab we have control over the conditions that we run our experiments in, and also we can test for something like causality. But then on the other hand, it also means that oftentimes it's quite far from the real world, and the findings that we get in the lab might not necessarily generalize to the real world and actual people. So the fact that we can now actually study people online gives us the chance to see what is it that people are actually doing in their day-to-day lives, and to capture these real behaviors. What's interesting about this is that oftentimes the stuff that we observe online is just a mere expression of something that's happening offline. So if we see that someone is listening to Adele on Spotify, or has checked in at Starbucks on Oxford Street, this is a digital trace, but it's actually reflecting a behavior that's happening offline.
Why is it that personality-centric targeting results in these significant increases in CTR, but moreover gigantic surge in conversion rates?
Yeah, so actually when I looked at the findings for the first time, I was really surprised to see that the effects of something like psychological targeting was bigger on conversion rates than it was on click-through rates. Because if you think about the customer journey, it's basically they click first and then, if anything, they purchase. So I would have expected the effect to be bigger on click-through rates. So I thought about it quite a lot of why we find these patterns. And I think the reason is probably that, first of all, clicks are really noisy. So especially when I'm using my phone, I often accidentally click on something that I didn't want to click on. So there's quite a lot of error around these clicks. And second of all, clicks are also something that are very spontaneous, and it's just the first expression of an interest. So I might think that, yes, I'm interested in playing a party app after having seen the ad. Maybe I like the picture, but then once I get to the Google Play Store and I read more about the app and the description, I probably realize that it's nothing for me, because I'm an introverted geek and I don't even like partying or drinking. So in that sense, conversions are, in comparison to clicks, are much more affected by like this deliberate choice, this deliberate decision to actually download something, to buy a product. And of course, at the moment, this is just an educated guess, and I think we need to go back to the lab and test that empirically and see what's really going on here.
What is the difference, according to you, between consumer-centric on the one hand and personality-centric on the other hand, in terms of approach? And what do companies need to have in place in order to make this move from customer to personality-centricness?
So I think there is actually not really a difference between the two. So customer-centric, or customer centricity, is really just this broad framework that describes how the customer experience can be personalized, can be made more appealing, and personality is one variable that can help us actually achieve this personalization. So at the moment, companies are mainly relying on something like demographic variables, age, gender, or past behaviors, some like the past purchases that a person has made, or the websites they have visited. But I think the more and more progress we make in kind of predicting something like psychological traits, the more and more personality variables or other psychological variables will become important in supporting this customer-centric approach.
In some of your research, we see that you target on one big five factor only. In order to improve the effectiveness of personality-centric targeting, how many of the big five traits should at least be targeted simultaneously?
Well, I think it's hard to say, and at the moment we don't have any empirical evidence for that question. But I don't think that there's like a minimum number or even an ideal number of traits that you should target simultaneously, because in the end it depends on the product. So if the product has distinct characteristics on one trait, on two traits, on 5 traits, and this is something we should take into consideration. And I think it might very well turn out that some of the traits are more effective. So we know, for example, or extroversion has traditionally been considered as one of the traits that are most important in explaining and predicting behavior. And similarly, it's also dependent on the situation. So, for example, we might find that openness works particularly well in the context of music preferences or movie preferences, while a trait like conscientiousness could actually be better at predicting insurance needs or insurance preferences. So in the end, I think there is no generic answer, and I think it really depends on the specific product and the specific situation that you're dealing with.
Let's assume I were a marketer and I would start with personality-centric marketing and I had a very limited budget. What would you advise me to spend my money on? On personality-centric messages or personality-centric product fit?
So again, I think in a way it depends on the product that you're selling. So from the research that we've done so far, it seems that product targeting is more effective in terms of increasing conversion rates, but that only works if you have a product that has distinct characteristics. So if you sell gardening equipment, for example, then it's quite likely that you might get the biggest effects if you target people who are introverted and who are conscientious. But the thing is that a lot of the products simply don't have these distinct characteristics. Just take a mobile phone, for example. In a way, everybody uses mobile phones and they're kind of very generic in terms of their functionality and what they can do. So unless there's a strong brand personality associated with that phone that kind of artificially creates a personality profile, you might be better off at simply doing like what I call message tailoring. So you can start with any audience you like. So you can say, okay, I want to sell my phone to extroverts today. How can I sell this phone to this type of person to make it as exciting and appealing as you possibly can. But then in the end, of course, ideally you would combine the two, because it's not even that much more effort to say, okay, I have a product that has distinct characteristics, I know what my target group looks like, and now I simply try to create my advertising material in a way that corresponds to that target group.
Already in 2012, your fellow researchers Kosinski and Stilwell showed that personality-centric targeting was the next step in marketing. And now your latest research seems to be indicating that the benefits are significant, in fact huge. How come do you think that industries like retail hardly seems to make use of these findings?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that psychological traits haven't really been used in customer-centric marketing so far is that they're latent constructs, so they're nothing that we can measure or observe directly. And for companies, it's pretty easy to collect data on someone's demographic variables, age and gender, or just collect data on what they did in the past, or what they purchased in the past, or which websites they've visited. But it's much harder to actually get to something like psychological traits. So yeah, my colleagues Michał Kosinski and David Stilwell showed that it's possible to predict personality from data that actually should be available to companies already. But the thing is that you still need to have the models or access to the models and algorithms that turn that data into psychological predictions. And that's something that companies simply don't have at the moment. But again, here there's just like so many companies, new tech companies entering the market and providing these commercial predictions of personality from really any kind of data you can possibly imagine. So I think that basically companies will get access to these models, and as soon as they have that, psychology or psychological traits will become much more important in the context of customer-centric marketing.
What industries do you think are most likely to make use of these findings first?
Well, I think it's probably industries that sell experiences. So if you think of the travel industry, there's so many different destinations that you could go to, and it's usually associated with an experience. So if you go to Berlin, it's probably about partying, it's about having fun, whereas if you go to Venice, it might be more about the culture, about like history and art. So I think that industries like the travel industry, but also the retail industry that is kind of so broad and that is really something that people use to express their personality, I think are the industries that are going to make use of such technologies first.
Early December 2016, the Swiss magazine Das Magazin sparked discussion about personality-centric targeting and election results, the American election results even. What can be the consequence of this discussion for the application of your research finding and the research itself?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the discussion that originated in the article has really been around the question of whether or not Cambridge Analytica and their psychological targeting helped Trump to win the election. And my opinion on that is that it's pretty much impossible to know because we don't have any access to the campaign details and we also don't have data on the campaign outcomes. And the fact that we simply can't answer the question means that in a way the whole discussion that evolved around the article, in my opinion, is somehow misguided. Because the point is that these technologies exist and that we can now implement them at an extremely large scale, as the Trump campaign shows. And we can implement them without the public even being aware of their existence. So I think the discussion that we should be having instead is really one of how can we regulate these technologies to make sure that they're being used to the benefit of society rather than against society. And I really hope that the article and all the publicity that it got really helps us to get the public attention and the public support that we need to convince policymakers that it's time to act now and that it's really time to come up with policies and regulations to make sure that we control these technologies and use it in the interest of society.
I try to wrap it up. Your fields of interests are personality and well-being, personality and advertising effectiveness, and personality and advertising aesthetics. What are the three important and unanswered questions in these fields, and what does that mean for your research priorities?
Well, there's so much I actually want to look at, but if I had to boil it down to three questions, I think the first one would actually be to see how effective personality or psychological targeting is in comparison to existing approaches. So we know from the results that we have so far that it is effective, but we don't really know how effective it is in comparison to demographic approaches, to behavioral approaches, and also how effective it could be if we were to combine these approaches. And the second question that is really interesting to me is to see if we can learn even more about someone's motivations and needs if we take the context into consideration. So if we know that an extroverted person is in an extroverted situation, does that make him more or less likely to respond to a personality targeted ad? And what's so interesting here is that we actually now have the opportunity to do that because all of us carry around smartphones, and these smartphones are just amazing technologies to see what's happening around us. So that we have microphone data that tells us something about how much conversation there's going on, or we have the accelerometer data that tells us how much physical activity there is. So in a way we already have access to the data, and now it's really a question of how can we make sense of the data that we get and how can we use it in combination with more stable psychological traits. And then the last question, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, is to look at the public opinion towards something like psychological targeting, because in the end it's supposed to help consumers find the stuff that they're really interested in. But obviously there's also the danger, and we've seen that in the context of the Trump campaign, that the technologies are being used without people even being aware of it. So what I'm interested in is to find out what is it that we can do to kind of maintain people's trust and to implement these technologies in a way that people accept them and consider them a useful service rather than like an invasion of their privacy.
Okay, thank you.